Hi, everybody. I'm Kim Wehle. This is Simple Politics. Today, I want to welcome my guest, David Lingelbach, who is a professor of entrepreneurship at my home school, University of Baltimore. He's also a columnist for The Hill, an expert in oligarchies, a former colleague, I should say, of Vladimir Putin, and has a lot to say about all things Ukraine, which I think we are all quite worried about and focused on today. So, David, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, Kim, thank you so much for inviting me. This is a great pleasure.
Can I start by asking you, what is an oligarch and how is that different, that definition different from just a CEO of a big company in America, for example?
Yeah, this is a great question, Kim. It's I think on a lot of people's minds, and there's a lot of confusion around the concept. So little history. Of course, Aristotle talked about oligarchs as the wealthy few who govern us, and that's kind of a useful starting point to think about oligarchs. But the way I like to think about them is this way: they utilize wealth to gain power, or conversely, they use power to gain wealth. And so they have this sort of unique combination of wealth and power in their tool bags, which makes them quite different from other types of leaders out there that might be either wealthy or powerful, but don't have both.
But again, how is that different then from the Koch brothers or Elon Musk or the number the various very wealthy people in America who also control corporate power? It sounds like what you're saying isn't that far from what we understand American corporate governance to be. And if that's the case, how is America different from Putin's Russia and the oligarchs over there?
Hmm. Yeah, so I think the CEOs, if you take the American CEOs, for example, most of them have quite limited power beyond the scope of their corporations, right? And I think the Koch versus Elon Musk comparison is really interesting. Charles Koch is an enormously powerful man. He exercises a kind of informal power, of course, through his work to promote sort of right-wing ideas in various settings, in colleges and universities and other places. That power, I mean, makes him one of the more powerful oligarchs in the US. By comparison, Elon Musk, who I quite admire as an entrepreneur, has rather limited power outside the scope of his Twitter followers and his corporation. And so I would put them in very different categories. And Musk is the more typical kind of CEO. But what we're noticing here in the US in particular in the age of technology is that a lot of the technology driven companies like, say, Facebook, Meta, or Google are starting to develop, because of the kinds of products they have, a very high level of informal power. Shoshana Zuboff wrote about this in The Age of Surveillance Capitalism very effectively. And I think those are the ones that we need to be thinking about as we look to the future.
So you're saying power over your corporate governance, your company, your profit, your P&L statements, all of that, shareholder pricing, board of directors, all of that. That's one thing.
Mhm.
But when it leaks into governance and impacting government in some way, that's maybe where we're from, wealthy CEO to oligarch territory.
That's right. I think it's in various shades legitimate, the power that corporate CEOs exercise within the four walls of their corporation. I think what's changing is that is, as you said, leaking out into the broader society in ways that we've seen occasionally in the past, but it's become much more dramatic over the last, say, 50 or so years.
What about former President Donald Trump calling Fox News anchors during his presidency? I mean, would you say Rupert Murdoch, who's kind of behind that empire, is an oligarch?
Yes, I mean Murdoch exercises quite a bit of what I call, again, informal power. He has an ability to influence the way that people who choose to consume his media products think. And he made a choice, we know this, to show support for former President Trump by giving Trump the airwaves pretty much when he wanted them to put across his message. So there you have an instance of Murdoch one kind of an oligarch, dealing with Trump, another type of oligarch.
What about Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook?
Yeah, I would say that Meta, Facebook, is an organization among others that we need to be quite concerned about, because they are exercising an enormous amount of informal power. I mean, Zuboff wrote about this, and I think she's right about this, that basically organizations like this are in some senses changing the way that we think, the way that we feel, the way that we act. And if that is not evidence of power, of course, informal power, I don't really know what would be evidence. So yes, Zuckerberg for sure.
So Elon Musk has a car company.
Mhm.
But the others we've talked about, you mentioned the Koch brother, or we mentioned the Koch brothers, but certainly Rupert Murdoch and Zuckerberg are in charge of information.
Yeah.
You- so do we have American oligarchs that are in industries other than media in some way, or social, including social media on the airwaves, as you indicating, having power over how people think? Do we have others that would be oligarchs, or is that pretty much exclusively where the danger is domestically?
No, historically, I think, Kim, America has been quite a little birthing place for oligarchs. You can go all the way back to George Washington, who, before Trump came along, was the wealthiest president we had. He was. We tend to forget about this, but Washington was quite a successful entrepreneur and business person, and his wealth enabled him to do some of the things he was able to do as our first president. And he's a great example of how oligarchs are not necessarily bad, right? There's this sort of pejorative connotation that's developed in the narrative around oligarchs, that they're always bad all the time, everywhere. But Washington, of course, I think we could all agree is probably a data point to the contrary. So we've been doing this for a long time, and we've produced oligarch presidents from oil and gas. Take George H.W. Bush as an example of that. Mining, Herbert Hoover is an example of that. So really all across American history, these people have popped up as presidents. We've had 7 oligarch presidents so far. And, that makes us as a country right up there as sort of an epicenter for these types of oligarchs.
It strikes me, though, David, that there's a distinction between a wealthy businessman who is elected to a presidency and someone like Mark Zuckerberg or Rupert Murdoch, who's exerting a oligarch-like power without any accountability at the ballot box.
Agreed. Yeah, that's why in my own research, I do make a sort of a distinction between these formal oligarchs, the ones that gain power, and the informal ones. We don't really have a lot of control over these informal oligarchs. They're exercising their rights as American citizens, as defined in the law, to do the things that they are doing. I mean, yes, some of them also go beyond that, but most of them are operating within the bounds of the law much of the time. And so those people are very different from the ones that use their wealth to gain power. We have mechanisms. We know that candidates are rich. And when Mike Bloomberg, for example, ran for office, we all knew that he's one of the richest people in this country at the time that he ran. And so I think you're right. We do have the information about those types, and less information about the informal types and what they're doing, and actually how much power they do have. Right? We don't as a researcher, I have to say, we don't have good measures of power of that sort.
Let's shift to Russia,
Okay.
because the word oligarch, you can correct me if I'm wrong, has come up in the media more than probably any time in my lifetime. I don't know about your lifetime, in the last 3 weeks, right? Since Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. And what I'm hearing is, while the oligarchs are upset because of the economic sanctions, I heard about an $80 million yacht stuck in a Norwegian port recently because people just won't sell the gas to this oligarch, so he can't get his massive yacht back home. Can you talk about how oligarchs in Russia might be a little bit different from American oligarchs, and what's the role they're playing in this war?
Sure. So this is Russia was the place where I first encountered oligarchs. This is what really got me going on this topic. You know, I worked there back in the 90s, and I started to meet the sort of the first generation of oligarchs, people who have kind of faded from the scene, but were the ones that were very involved in sort of privatization of Soviet era industrial assets primarily. And I also met at that same time, as you mentioned in the beginning, Mr. Putin, who I worked with as a counterpart. I'm not sure I would call him my colleague, but as a counterpart for about a year and a half, negotiated against him, signed a lot of documents with him, et cetera. And so that's where I really became aware of this phenomenon. And then, of course, Mr. Putin came to power, and the oligarchy changed. So we had sort of generation one, sort of in the 90s. And ever since Putin came to power in let's say 2000, we've had generation two oligarchs. They're very different from the first generation. There were actually some, legitimate entrepreneurs in that first generation. This second generation is much more dependent upon Putin for their access to wealth. And I think the key thing here, Kim, to get is that Putin himself is an oligarch. I mean, I chuckle when I see him give interviews and talk about oligarchs as sort of, those people over there. He is the most consequential oligarch of the modern world. He is worth, put a number on it, anywhere from, I would say, $7 billion, that's my estimate, up to, Bill Browder thinks maybe as much as $200 billion. He is a billionaire any way you look at it. Very cleverly hidden assets. And of course, he's very powerful. Even before this war began with Ukraine, he was routinely ranked as one of the most powerful people. So to shift to sort of Sicilian mafia language for a moment, he's a capo di tutti capi. He's the head of all heads. He is the oligarch who controls access to wealth and power in Russia today. And that's a very different system than, of course, we have here in the States.
Okay, that's a bit of my follow-up question because I'm still a bit puzzled over how, on the one hand, we can say we've got George Washington's an oligarch,
Mm.
and Vladimir Putin's an oligarch, and oligarchs follow the rules. So, can you help me understand, David, what is it about Vladimir Putin, the oligarch, that is so over the line? I mean, what is the line? What is the nefariousness about, again, if we define oligarchs as extremely wealthy individuals who also have political power, whether that be at the ballot box or by virtue of their influence through their money, their control of media, whatever the reason is, that's the oligarch, where you're crossing the line between government and just private wealth.
Yeah, so Kim, I think this is where we get into this issue of the institutional differences across the world, the cultural differences across the world. What we here in America today might accept as reasonably legitimate oligarchic behavior is definitely very different from what is the case in Russia and has been since the fall of the Soviet Union. And some people would say even before that there were oligarchs sort of in the Gorbachev period already beginning to make their rise. And that has a lot to do, of course, fundamentally with something you know a lot about, which is rule of law. I mean, it is in Russia, the rule of law is less important, or at least let's say defined in a very different way than it would be here in the States. And the reliance is much more on what the Russians call blat, which is essentially influence. You do this for me, I'll do that for you kind of thing. And so that's the system in which Putin grew up. That's the system in which the oligarchs there grew up. He, for better or for worse, is Putin, that is to say, is defined by most Russians today as a legitimate leader. I mean, he's not as seen as somebody who's outside the norms of Russian state behavior over the long term. Now, the invasion of Ukraine may very well shift that assessment of him, but up until late February, that is certainly what the majority of Russian folks were saying in both publicly and privately. So So that's the fundamental thing to get here. That has worked very effectively for Putin and for all of his associates that have gotten wealthy and have created a, you know, as we can see now, kind of dysfunctional state structure, but one that also still has a lot of power.
So here in the United States, we have oligarchs, but we have rules, laws, we have the Constitution, we have federal statutes, we have regulations, we have state laws, state constitutions, and we have an enforcement mechanism, both through with law enforcement officers and, for the most part, neutral judges that are really there to implement the law. And so the oligarchs still have to a large degree, operate within that structure, or there could be investigations, prosecutions, on the one hand. In Russia, it sounds like what maybe you're saying is that Vladimir Putin is the law. It's the law according to Vladimir Putin, and the oligarchs gain power and influence and wealth so long as they adhere to the dictates of Vladimir Putin. But that's very different from a separate set of laws that apply to everyone. Is that a fair statement?
I think it is, and when you run afoul of this regime, bad things can happen to you. We of course have so many examples of this. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, in many ways, was sort of the canary in the coal mine when he was arrested in 2003 by Putin's government, charged with a series of crimes, and went to prison for 10 years. I mean, Khodorkovsky was one of the wealthiest oligarchs in the pre-Putin Russia, and sought to challenge Putin, and began to mount a kind of a political challenge to Putin, and he went to prison for a long time. Of course, others, Boris Nemtsov, who I was very friendly with and knew well when I worked in Russia, who was probably the leading sort of liberal alternative to Putin, assassinated on the streets of Moscow, outside the walls of the Kremlin, and nothing really was done about it. Certainly not the people who were ultimately responsible were never brought to justice. So that's the system, and the oligarchs that have been successful have worked well within that system, and the ones that are rising now, people like Yuri Kovalchuk, for example, who recently there was a piece in the Times that talked about this, seems to be emerging as Putin's number two now, are especially adept at sort of working that type of a system, which really has no checks and balances in it at all.
As I listen to what you're saying, what comes to mind, given my work publicly around democracy, is that Donald Trump's presidency was some form of an oligarchy, and one that pushed for a larger regime change along the lines of Vladimir Putin. That is, uh, Donald Trump is the law. And if you cross Donald Trump, you will be punished, not because it's not consistent with neutral laws, but because it's not consistent with the law according to Donald Trump. Does that resonate with you? Are you worried about that with another Trump term?
I'm very concerned about it. And the only thing that gives me hope, Kim, is that the institutional structure of our country is quite different from that of Russia. I mean, Russians, this is a generalization, but I think historically pretty accurate. Russians are quite comfortable with strong autocratic governments. There's not a lot of history there of democracy. I lived in Russia during that brief period in the 90s where there was kind of a messy democracy, but there were free and reasonably fair elections that were held. And what I think people learned from that, and what I certainly heard from many of my Russian friends, was that a lot of people were uncomfortable with the uncertainty that was around all of that. So that's a fundamental difference. That the Russian system, going back for hundreds of years, has been quite comfortable with that, whereas our system, by contrast, has a different tradition. So that does give me hope, but obviously, as we both know, there's lots of forces working right now that could take us back into sort of a kind of a limited form of autocracy.
Well, and there's some hunger or appetite with amongst a large segment of the American population for that kind of government, that kind of certainty, that kind of just loyalty to a person and a belief system rather than a shared collective value system. I do. I can't help though. First of all, I can't help but ask about Vladimir Putin, but I'll get to that. What I want to ask you, David, though, and this has bothered me a lot. Do you think American corporations, the power in America, which after Citizens United, which declared corporate entities, this fictitious entity of a corporation, declared them as having First Amendment rights, like the living, breathing people that make up that corporation. Therefore, they flood the airwaves with political ads, and they do control elections. Do you think there's that it that they understand that if it were to go more to a Putin type oligarchy regime, that it would be bad for business, or maybe it wouldn't be bad for business? Do you know what I'm saying? What is it? Does it corporate America understand that's actually not great for their bottom line, or is that better? So long as you follow the ruler and you don't get shot in the streets, is that better in terms of amassing wealth and power?
I mean, I think, Kim, that that sort of a scenario is one in which some corporations will do better than others, right? I mean, we have a very sort of energetic corporate sector in the United States, and they're quite adept at responding to changes of various sorts to varying degrees. And so, if you use Russia as an example, the people that did well in one regime, the pre-Putin regime, are quite different from the ones that are doing well or did well under Putin. And so I think that's what you're going to get. You're going to get a reshuffling. And I'm not necessarily persuaded that the US corporate sector, staring into the possibility of some sort of an autocracy in 2024, is going to become, terrified. I think that they tend as a whole, speaking as a former banker, to be pretty pragmatic, and so they tend to think in terms of, well, how can we manage these risks, or exploit the opportunities that come about as a result of these changes like this. That's I think that's what you see in Russia, but you see it in other oligarchies around the world as well.
Well, that's disheartening, honestly, to hear. I mean, it makes sense to me that, but you'd hope that there'd be some surgical strike favoring democracy that also affects the bottom line. But there will be some losers in it, right? There'll be winners and losers, but that's just capitalism.
That's it, exactly.
So Putin, Vladimir Putin, people call him a sociopath, a psychopath. I'm interested in your thoughts knowing him, and does it surprise you all these years later that he would spearhead such heartless carnage amongst innocent population of civilians, like yesterday reportedly bombing a shelter with children and women?
Yeah. So, I've been studying Putin for a long time, and I said when I first met him and worked with him, and I've continued to say all along, up until I think late February of this year, that I thought Putin was the most clever person that I had ever met. I was occasionally asked by, administrations here in the US for, sort of informal comments on Putin. And I always said to them, you need to understand that he is probably smarter than your guy. So, and different presidents either got that or didn't get that. And so I think one of the challenges, Kim, we face with Putin is understanding who he really is. I think that those of us who have been at this for a while have developed a number of different ways of seeing him. Fiona Hill, who I have enormous regard for, both as a student of Putin, but also for her work on the impeachment process. I mean, she called him a KGB operative, and so have others. That's how she fundamentally defined him. Other people see him as a czar-like figure, and or a judo player, kind of using leverage to get what he wants. I tend to think of him fundamentally as an adventurer. I think my research on Putin kind of has taken me back into his early years before he was well known, and he was that kid, Kim, that was always wanting to be the big adventurer. He admired sort of both real and movie depictions of KGB spies that would go and do all these adventurous things around the world. and in fact kept pictures of some of these people in his bedroom. And I mean, he like all of us as kids, we have our heroes. Those were Putin's heroes growing up. And I think for me, the way I see Ukraine is as his biggest adventure of his life. I mean, I know it's very hard to talk about this for those of us who respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and B, think that the Ukrainians should not have this happening to them. But in many ways, from his perspective, this is his great adventure. And it's also, I believe, his view that this is his attempt to change the international order fundamentally into an order that is more suited to the preferences of states like Russia. I don't, Kim, yet see any compelling evidence that he has some sort of a psychological malady. Okay, I'm not a psychologist, so take it for what it's worth. But I think it's too easy to say that he's a sociopath or a psychopath, or as you're starting to see now, people just are sort of demonizing him and et cetera, because that leads to obvious policy choices, doesn't it? Right? It actually makes policy very easy. If you're dealing with the devil, well, then you know what you need to do, right? It's very straightforward, right? Whereas I think Putin is a lot more complicated, like we all are, right? He's quite a complicated character. He's clearly now, as he loses some of the military battle in Ukraine, he's getting himself painted a little bit into a corner as well, which we can talk about what that might imply.
Yeah, I want to wrap up with that, but as far as just to follow up on the last explanation, I obviously I don't know Putin. I'm not a medical psychological expert either. The way I define sociopath or psychopath, though, is someone who lacks compassion, right? Who doesn't have a stop sign or a slow down flashing light signal when it comes to transgressing boundaries of core humanity. And that's what makes the explorer so dangerous, because there isn't that psychological barrier. I agree with you. Psychopath tends to have a pejorative sort of connotation in society that, oh, you're chopping up bodies in the basement. But no, it really it has a sort of a medical technical understanding that there just aren't, your mind, it's not even necessarily a pathology. It's a personality disorder where you just don't have the yellow lights, the flashing lights that the rest of us have inherently to manage our behavior. So your explorer instinct is at any cost.
Yeah, I think that there's something to that. I think, though, the thing to keep in mind, Kim, is that again, I'm trying all my work to kind of put myself in the shoes of these people to kind of see how they think and how they see the world. From Putin's perspective, I think he's trying to do right by the Russians. He's the president of Russia. He's the head of state of a country of 140 million people, and a country, as we both know, that has had a lot of trauma visited on it, and of course has visited plenty of trauma on other people as well. And I think that what it's so important to do is to kind of see why Putin has remained so popular and is still popular to this day. I mean, the latest polling that I've seen out of Russia is that the stuff that's not state controlled, of course, is suggestive that he remains very popular.
But
And
isn't that partly the propaganda that
it is.
Russians are fed lies, and so they don't believe there is a war. They thought that Ukraine was controlled by Nazis and they'd liberate them. So to say this is good for Russia, that's still good for Putin's view of Russia, and that, in my mind, that's different from a sense of core humanity and compassion for killing babies,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
so you could still have a stop sign. You can still want what's best for Russia and have a stop sign at killing babies. And I just think my personal view just is, I think people, we all have this normalcy bias where we assume every human has that sense of right and wrong at some point that is boiled down to core humanity and not political calculus. And it seems to me that there are certain oligarchs that get where they are because there just isn't that brake pedal that there is for the
Yeah,
rest of us.
I think that's spot on. And I think what Putin has been doing in his career has been gradually ratcheting up. I think he's been adventuring and kind of trying to maybe figure out in his own mind, like how far is he willing to push it. He, right after he became prime minister in 1999, he started the second Chechen war. We all know what happened in Chechnya. I mean, Grozny was leveled. Some people are very concerned, I think legitimately, that that's happening, of course, today in Mariupol, but also perhaps could happen in Kyiv. And then he went into Georgia in 2008, ratcheted it up a little bit more because it's international. Then he did the Crimea thing in Donbass in 2014, ratcheted it up a little bit more. I think, again, I'm just trying to understand him. I think he's trying to figure out what's his limit. And I think you and I are right to be concerned. He does not appear to have that brake pedal.
So so back to your other point. I'm fascinated. I know we're almost out of time, but what is the exit strategy here, David? It's not going to be military, force from allies of Ukraine, because people are worried about a third world war. You've mentioned sort of exit strategies that are a little more behind the scenes. Where do you see this going in the best case, where we can all imagine the worst case scenario? What how do you thread the needle out of this?
Yeah, I think there's a couple components to this, Kim. I think one is that as kind of distasteful as it might be, I think we have to find a way to kick Vladimir Putin upstairs. Now, what does that look like? He I think has this idea about this new international order. So maybe there needs to be a new alliance that needs to be formalized, and maybe he needs to be in charge of that, kind of like the Secretary General of the new alliance that he seems to be forming with China, with Iran, and with others. And that would give him a huge international sort of canvas on which to play, but also constrained perhaps to some degree by the Chinese. That's an interesting possibility that I'm not sure has yet been really explored yet, although the Chinese might be doing something like that. He's not going, in my judgment, to leave Ukraine and just walk away with nothing. So I think what the Ukrainians are facing, I'm sure, is this very, very painful choice of what do we need to give this man in order to make this stop? I think Volodymyr Zelensky and the others in the government and the Ukrainian people have been enormously brave, but there will come a point, I think, where they'll have to decide, do we want to become a society of 40 million guerrilla fighters that are going to fight this into the dust? Or is there some alternative to that that could lead at least to a ceasefire? The problem, I think, though, Kim, is that Putin has gotten a taste. He's not yet gotten any limits put on him. And so if you do a ceasefire, is that the end of it?
What
And
about the sanctions? You don't think that affects him because he's pocketed everything already?
I honestly, Kim, yeah, I don't see the sanctions having that big of an impact. In fact, I'm kind of waiting for this other shoe to drop. Putin sort of signed an order last week that said that they were going to stop exporting raw materials to the West. And I could see a counter sanction in which he stops sending us, for example, uranium. Well, okay, we are utterly dependent on Russian uranium. And France, of course, which has 50% of its electrical power, is utterly dependent on Russian uranium. Think about the implications of that. So I think the sanctions side of this, my read of Russians is that they have been prepared for this. And they have been through this before. With the sanctions thing happened to a limited extent in 2014, but just psychologically, Russians know how to hunker down.
The oligarchs aren't upset with him.
I,
They can't have their luxury yachts and their Louis Vuitton, whatever.
I mean, most of the smart ones saw something building and diversified. I mean, Mikhail Friedman, who I also studied quite closely. I mean, he moved to London years ago, and sort of, as some of these people have done, taken on citizenship, etc. I mean, whether that really ultimately will protect them, time will tell. But I think most sensible oligarchs, the ones that had choices that already diversified, and the ones that didn't, they're probably now facing a pivot to some sort of a new regime after Putin, which, by the way, Kim, I think will look quite similar to Putin, and so a lot of these people will continue to maintain their power and wealth in it. That new
I think
system.
that's a hard thing probably for people to hear. I agree with your pragmatism. I think there's a sense that, listen, he can't get away with it, but it sounds like maybe one of the most realistic options is he does get away with it, and he gets some sort of narcissistic plug for the twilight years. That is, he said put him upstairs, not downstairs, but to see him somehow in chains and scorned by the global community with the Ukrainians circling back. Probably unlikely. Hard reality to hear. But David, thank you so much for coming on Simple Politics. Really fascinating. I learned a lot.
Oh, Kim, thank you so much. Glad to talk to you.
Thanks everybody for watching. This is Simple Politics with Kim Wehle.